Well, we'll give people a little time to join us. I guess since it's only you and me, I'm going to stop sending out these MailChimp notices on Sunday morning because nobody else is coming to the panel.
Yeah.
so
yeah, just Yuan and
well, Yuan comes and
was it
yeah, I guess
David?
Yeah, David Gee came once.
Yeah, David Gee.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't know whether he thought I shut him down or something, but I didn't. Anyway,
no, you didn't.
We are online, and we actually have somebody watching us. So,
excellent.
Good morning. It's 8:00 in the eastern United States. Do you know where your children are? Yeah. It's early. Okay. So today, I want to talk about the experiential and the participatory in spirituality. And in order to get into this a little bit, we have to start by understanding that as long as you sit in front of your television set or you stare at your computer, nothing's happening. You might be educating yourself, and that's not a bad thing. But otherwise, you're just a lump of protoplasm that is not making things happen in the world. And last night, Jordan Hoggard and I were involved in a session where we had about, I think, 30 people in the Zoom participation, and we had all done what we call doodles to connect ourselves with our unconscious. I mean, that's the point, to connect ourselves with the unconscious, with the collective unconscious, also to understand what it is that we want. And it was a very good session, and we had since then we stopped only 8 hours ago or so, or no, 10 hours ago, but we've already had 355 people hit it, and that's an amazing number. And all of the people that were in that session are participating from a spiritual point of view, because the process of doodling is a connection with the spiritual domain. And as I said last night, one time I had one of these adult coloring books, and there were a lot of people, including me, who didn't understand adult coloring books. Maybe, what was it, 10 years ago when they started to get popular. And I didn't understand the use of them or why, because, we all did that when we were between 5 and 10 years old. And the point is, the point came up that if you fill in the colors on one of those, then you're connecting with your unconscious side, with your God image, from a psychological point of view. And that in turn connects you to the collective. And you can dispute that all you want, but I've spent the last 5 years going on putting videos on this YouTube channel about how that works. So I'm not really going to describe it now, but the point is that what drives us and what makes our lives worth living is within us. It's not out there. Okay, there's no Geppetto puppeteer guiding your life. It's you that's guiding your life, and so, you know, going to movies or watching YouTube videos is all well and good, because you need that, especially when you're growing into maturity, and that's basically the first half of life. You have to try to figure out what's it all about. I mean, in my youth, there was a movie with Albert Finney called "What's It All About," or it was called Alfie, but the theme song from the movie was "What's It All About, Alfie." And so when we're born, we are wild animals, and we have to learn from our parents, just as a baby giraffe has to learn, or any other creature. We learn from our parents how we are to live our lives in the world. But once we reach a certain level of maturity, then it's us. We're the ones that are making the decisions. And it just so happened that last night, after our session, I turned on the television just to cool out for an hour before I went to bed. And my wife and I have been watching recently the HBO series entitled John Adams. It's about President John Adams, the second president of the United States. And one of the crucial figures in the particular episode we were watching last night, which is episode 3, was that during the Revolutionary War, the second, third, and fourth presidents of the United States were in Paris, and they essentially spent the entire Revolutionary War in Paris. George Washington was leading the American army, but those 3 men, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, were all in Paris. And what were they doing? They were raising money for the war effort. So they were participating in the war. They weren't doing it with guns and bombs. They were doing it with getting the money and the alliances that were necessary to win the war, and at great personal sacrifice, because John Adams left his wife, Abigail Adams, with originally 4 children, but then he took one of them, John Quincy Adams, with him to Paris. So she was left with 3 children in a farmhouse on a 10-acre farm, and was basically left on her own to tough it out. And why was that? It was because in the collective of the United States, what was before the pre-United States, the colonial era, the collective had decided to separate from England. And it was a very difficult, wrenching decision, but they did. And it took a lot of courage by a lot of people to make that happen, but they were participating. They knew what they wanted as a people. And finally, when they declared independence, they were unanimous. By hook or by crook, they made a unanimous decision to break from England, and they knew that there would be a war over it. And so they sent their sons to war. But the very interesting thing is that the second, third, and fourth presidents of the United States were not in the colonies fighting. They weren't shooting guns. What were they doing? They were gathering money and alliances that would allow them to win the war. And that was the crucial factor. If France hadn't joined the revolution on behalf of the American colonies, America wouldn't have its independence even today. The United States wouldn't. And so there's something that pushes people like that. And there's something that pushes each one of us. And that something comes from within us. You know, what was driving John Adams and Abigail Adams to put up with all that hardship, with all that separation? You know, when John Quincy Adams was 14, John Adams sent him from Paris to St. Petersburg to the court of Catherine the Great as an ambassador to Catherine the Great. Now, can you imagine sending your 14-year-old son off to negotiate the future of a country?
Right.
Pretty incredible. And so they were obviously learning some valuable lessons. And, you know, as the U.S. began to be formed, they recognized that they were looking a little rustic here in the United States. And right away, they had to build a dominating capital of the United States in Washington. And that was one of the first orders of business, which was to build the White House, which John Adams was the first president to occupy the White House, and build what you find today. The U.S. Capitol was built at that time, or around 1800. It was begun to be built, and so all those things were pushed by a participatory spirit of, we're going to build this country and this is going to be ours. And so, you know, there's also, you know, there's a counter to that, which is a destructive spirit. And we've seen that in our current president in spades over the last 4 years, where he's tried to tear down everything that others put together, but now he's been stopped, and he, you know, my expectation is that he will simply fade away after the inauguration of the new president. I know that he thinks that he can start a new TV network and tell his own brand of lies and so on, but that's not going to be tolerated. Rupert Murdoch, who is the owner of Fox News, will have something to say about that, and so there will be consequences for trying to do that for Donald Trump, and he's going to find that after he's out, his support is going to fade away. That's my prophecy, and I'm sticking to it. I had prophesied that he would lose in the Supreme Court 9-0, and my prophecy proved to be true. Okay, so how does that relate to the lesson that I want to bring out today? Well, it relates to it because we have to understand what the spirit is trying to do and how it's trying to create the human family and humanity itself. And Dr. Jung spoke about this, you know, in the 1950s, and he pointed out that the great task of religions is to reinterpret all of the religions of the world, because all of the religions of the world developed largely based on dreams and visions that early Iron Age men had. And so if you look at the Bible, most of the big things that happened in the Bible, for example, the Annunciation and, God coming to Moses on Mount Sinai, all those things were visions. Okay, those were either visions or dreams. The Virgin Mary had a vision, and she declared that her baby was going to be the Son of God. And well, okay, there's no denying. And so I want to read this quote from Jung, and then a quote from Answer to Job, and then I'll go into Jorge Ferrer's comment, because the point is that Jorge Ferrer is pointing to what needs to be done, the great task, the reinterpretation of religion, and so on. But here's what Jung said, and he said this in a letter to Morton T. Kelsey on the 3rd of May, 1958. He said, "We're still looking back to the Pentecostal events in a dazed way, instead of looking forward to the goal the Spirit is leading us to. Therefore, mankind is wholly unprepared for the things to come. Man is compelled by divine forces to go forward to increasing consciousness and cognition, developing further and further away from his religious background because he does not understand it anymore. His religious teachers and leaders are still hypnotized by the beginnings of the then new eon of consciousness, instead of understanding them and their implications. What one once called the Holy Ghost is an impelling force, creating wider consciousness and responsibility, and thus enriched cognition. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity." Now, incarnation means into our carnate bodies, into the meat of our bodies. I mean, incarnation literally means into the meat. Okay, so it's the progressive activity of the deity into our bodies. Now, Dr. Jung referred to the self, the deepest archetype in the unconscious, as the God image. That's our individual God image. And he also referred to the collective unconscious as God, simply, simple equivalency. And we can't deny it, because as we experience the great forces in our lives, they're coming across to us as a godlike power, as God, or maybe as the shadow of God, also, which we've experienced here in the U.S. But my point is that, going back to the beginning of this, the early American presidents were pushed to create an independent country. That's what they saw, and that's what needed to be done. That's what the spirit of all the American colonists of whatever origin decided. They'd been coming to the U.S., to the colonies, for 150 years. Okay, my ancestors came from Holland 150 years before the American Revolution. And they had lived pretty peacefully with people of all stripes, including the Native Americans, for that first 50-year period. And but they were pushed to do that. The spirit told them to do that. I mean, who leaves their home in developed Europe in 1625, gets on a leaky boat and takes his wife and 3 children to to the first Dutch settlement in North America, which was Manhattan, where there were 150 European settlers to start a new life. Well, they did it because they didn't want to be fighting a war, and the knuckleheads that were in the Spanish government in those days thought that they could come up to Holland every summer and beat the Dutch back into the Catholic Church. And that was called the 80 Years' War. And my ancestors said, I don't care about this war. I'm going to go to the New World. And, you guys fight over whatever you want to fight over, but my spirit is telling me that to go build a new country, and that's what they did, and that's what many of our ancestors did. I mean, if you're a 3rd or 4th generation American, then almost certainly you have DNA from many other nationalities and cultural groups within you already. We're literally the 57 varieties, and in my case, although I point to the Dutch ancestry, which is it's actually 1/4 of my DNA ancestry at my grandparents' level. I also have a Swedish American grandmother, a Welsh American grandmother, and a Pennsylvania Dutch grandfather and great-grandfather, which means German. And so all these people were quite different, but we all melded together. We are the melting pot. And so Dr. Jung also, in addition to that quote there, I'll just read again from the last paragraph of Answer to Job. I have Answer to Job here, which is...
Before you do, I think it's important to note, too, that your story there is really poignant because it expresses how they were subject to that impelling force of the Holy Ghost, Sophia, right. Wisdom, that right. pulled and turned them back within to go somewhere or create something else.
Precisely, right. And so the force is with you, right? And
right.
This is what George Lucas has taught us about for 50 years. And so we have to understand, what is it? Why are we here? And what are we doing? Are we here to be couch potatoes watching television? Well, watching television is one way that we learn right now. And so I'm not ranting against television. We have to watch a lot of it to understand where we are on the planet. But then we have to convert that into lives and into the future of humanity. And so anyway, I'm going to read this last page of Answer to Job once again, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Because, the churches have stuck to the uniqueness of Christ as the one God-man. And what Jung said is that we all have a piece of Christ within us. And again, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about the Spirit telling us what we need to do to make a better world for humanity. And so I'll just start in the middle of the paragraph, I guess. Wait a minute, how far back? Because unfortunately, Jung's paragraphs are a couple pages long long sometimes. All right, I guess I'll read the whole paragraph. Why not? It's
You're on page.
I am on page 107.
107, right? Okay.
Of Answer to Job, which is this is the 50th anniversary edition. So.
And you're on 20, right?
Pardon?
The XX.
Yeah. XX, yeah. It will probably have become clear to the reader that the account I have given to the development of symbolic entities corresponds to a process of differentiation of human consciousness. But since, as I showed in the introduction, the archetypes in question are not mere objects of the mind, but are also autonomous factors, i.e., living subjects, the differentiation of consciousness can be understood as the effect of the intervention of transcendentally conditioned dynamisms. In other words, what he's saying here is that the figures that he ran into in the Red Book are real figures. They really exist, and they represent themselves to us mere mortals as images of human beings, but they really represent something that's deep inside us, that's directing us. And so anyway, I'll get back to some of the comments on the YouTube channel here in a minute. Let me get this in. Okay. So anyway, the archetypes are living subjects. In other words, they have their effect on us, and they react to the things that we do.
And I think those three words are really important, the transcendentally conditioned dynamisms, because then the transcendentally, that from which comes outside, conditions the interrelationships within, so that then that all engages connection at both the personal and the collective scale in just those three words.
Yep, precisely. So, let's see. In this case, it would be the archetypes that accomplish the primary transformation. But since in our experience, there are no psychic conditions which could be observed through introspection outside the human being, the behavior of the archetypes cannot be investigated at all without the interaction of the observing consciousness. So in other words, we can only look within. We can't really see the archetypes out there in hyperspace, but nonetheless, they're there, and we can only observe them through thinking about them, which is what we do in our Tarot group. Each week we're talking about, each week we've been talking about an archetype and how we have interacted with it in our lifetimes to help all of you understand what it is that we're talking about. But this is all introspection. In other words, the archetypes are ever the same, and the tarot cards just give us a way to look at them, but they give us a way to look at them in 1,000 different ways. There are thousands of tarot decks, and all of them have different images, but they all point at the same thing, which is why the tarot has not changed in 600 years, why it is archetypal.
And Joseph Campbell speaks to the hero with the 1,000 faces, and then the 1,000-petal lotus, and that's the same principle.
Yeah, right. Okay, so therefore, the question as to whether the process is initiated by consciousness or by the archetype can never be answered. We don't know whether the archetype is pushing us forward or our consciousness is pushing us forward. And it's actually a combination of both. Unless, in contradiction to experience, one either robbed the archetype of its autonomy or degraded consciousness to a mere machine. In other words, both consciousness and archetype are interacting all the time within us. We find ourselves in best agreement with psychological experience if we concede to the archetype a definite measure of independence and to consciousness a degree of creative freedom proportionate to its scope. So in other words, the archetypes can beat us up as mine have done by breaking my leg and a few other things in my lifetime. And, you know, I have the scars to prove it. Or, you know, we can try to arm wrestle it through our consciousness and our consciousness, but in fact, we're not in control. The archetypes actually are stronger than we are. And so we need to, number one, first learn how to manage ourselves. That's what growing up is all about, and reaching adulthood and maturity is all about. And then we need to learn how to plug that in to the rest of us. And the unique thing about Donald Trump is that because he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he never had to interact with the rest of society the way most of us do. And so he never got beaten up the way the rest of us do. And therefore he got away with a lot of behaviors that most human beings don't get away with. And we gain maturity. So,
and also modeled by a monster of a dad and a doormat of a mom. And so all of his things went unchecked or modeled to monster, as it would be.
And so he thought he was the second coming.
Or even the first.
Or even the first, and he definitely is not. He's just a pathetic human being. But and as my father said, taught me long ago, and which I know from personal experience since, but in the fourth grade, my father was trying to buck me up to face. I was in the fourth grade, and there was this tough farm kid that was in the fifth grade, and we were in a country school, so it was a rough and tumble place, a 2-room schoolhouse out in the middle of Michigan that had 7 grades in it and 2 teachers to teach 7 grades. And so this farm kid was bigger than me because he was a year older, and he was being a bully. And my father just said, well, remember, a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And so one day, you know, the next day, probably at the drinking fountain, we had to stand in line to get to the drinking fountain. I turned to, he was pushing me or something, and I just said to him, you know, hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. He backed off, and we were the best of friends after that. Amazing. And the point is that, you know, the same is true of Donald Trump, except nobody's called him on it yet.
Well, and you went straight to the core, because then you stepped right past the bluster, and it didn't matter the volume, the noise, the appearance, or the body. Strength was only in power, and the power, when you went right to the heart of the matter, he didn't have all his tools. You basically disarmed him.
Right. Right. Okay. So there, and good morning, Deborah.
Good morning.
Nice to see you here. It's early. Okay. So there then arises that reciprocal action between 2 relatively autonomous factors, which compels us, when describing and explaining the processes, to present sometimes the one and sometimes the other factor as the acting subject, even when God becomes man. So what that means is sometimes the archetypes have us, and sometimes we have the archetypes. And if we're wise enough and mature enough, maybe we have a little bit better chance of controlling the archetypes than if we're not. And
that God then differentiates to the creative freedom proportionate to our scope. I mean,
Right.
so wherever we are, that's the type of and delineation of God we imbue.
Yeah. And so anyway, the Christian solution has hitherto avoided this difficulty by recognizing Christ as the one and only God-man. But the indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person in man, brings about the Christification of many. And the question then arises whether these many are all complete God-men. So what he's saying here is that, okay, Christ was recognized as the God-man, and so everybody's going to fall into lockstep behind him. But the reality is we're all God men and God women. And so, and this is what Dr. Ferrer is getting to, which is why I'm doing this as a preliminary, that he's getting to the idea that it's up to all of us to enact the species that we want. We're all humanity. And if we are going to enact the humanity as a species that saves itself, then we have to have consciousness and at least apply our piece of God's puzzle. And that's what we do in maturity. Okay, so he says such a transformation would lead to insufferable collisions between them, to say nothing of the unavoidable inflation to which the ordinary mortal, who is not freed from original sin, would instantly succumb. Okay, so Donald Trump is a perfect example of this. He's been insufferable for most of his life, I guess, and he certainly is inflated. Because he can, he goes to the Army Navy game yesterday to puff himself up, to get somebody to put a movie camera or television camera on him, so he can be honored by the Corps of Cadets and the Brigade of Midshipmen. But that's, he can force that upon the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps, but everybody knows that he hasn't earned it, okay? That he hasn't earned the respect that honor represents, and therefore it's just hollow. It's entirely hollow.
And it's a direct expression of an externalized action rather than that indwelling or the, I think, the impelling force, which is then that the anima, the Holy Ghost, the Spirit.
I mean, I was physically at the Army Navy game in 1961 when Jack Kennedy was there, and when he walked across the field. And I can tell you that there's quite a qualitative difference between that day and yesterday.
Right.
And there's quite a qualitative difference between PT 109 and bone spurs, and everybody in the U.S. military surely knows that.
And PT 109 is, just for everyone out there,
PT 109 was
just for people who don't
John
know.
Kennedy's heroic act when he was the commander of a PT boat in the Pacific during World War II, and it was very dark one night, and his PT boat was literally cut in half by a Japanese destroyer, and his men were all left swimming, 13 men or so, something like that. And he managed to, despite an injury to himself, he managed to organize his men and get them to an island where they would be safe overnight. And then when they woke up in the morning, when the sun came up, they realized that they weren't safe. And so hid and managed to get to another island where they would be safer. And then Kennedy managed to get a message to his support headquarters saying that they were still alive and could they be rescued. And he wrote that on a coconut or something like a coconut. He wrote this message, and he got it to a native who took it to the American Navy and got them saved. And so it was true leadership and true courage, and nothing like President Bone Spurs. And so everybody in the military understands that.
And that's that impelling force that he enacted from within for the collective of his 13 men, right, and pushed them all forward.
Right. Okay, so I'll just finish up this paragraph now. In these circumstances, it is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul and his split consciousness. On one side, he felt he was the apostle directly called and enlightened by God, and on the other side, a sinful man who could not pluck out the thorn in the flesh and rid himself of the satanic angel who plagued him. That is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is and is never more than his own limited ego before the one who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky. And so here Dr. Jung is pointing out the immensity of God, and even though he resides within each one of us, it's not us that's not us that's the knower here.
Well, and he alludes to as above, so below, with fathomless as the abysms of the earth and as vast as the sky. So he's putting in that you must have a foot to touch hell to reach heaven, and the as above, so below, which is a consistent theme throughout as well.
Right. Okay, so quickly going through the YouTube chat. Good morning, Art. In general, I'm not going to respond to greetings, but let's see. Daniel says, what if we've reached the limit of human flesh existence? Well, so far as I know, we've not reached any such limit as yet. And the only question is, will we destroy ourselves before we do reach such a limit? He goes on, we're becoming technologically more advanced as a group, but when everything else, we're more or less the same as we were in the first civilization. I wonder if we're going to merge into one true technology. In a small way, we are the internet, but it's impossible that in the future we'll have tech with which we can merge totally and evolve. I'm not believing that, Daniel, and I'm going to tell you why. It's very simple. There's a qualitative difference between the logos and the eros. And when we talk about technology, we're talking exclusively about the logos. That is, we've applied our consciousness to create things. So very simply, if you look at the room around you, everything that's in your room except living beings was constructed by other human beings, and it was done 100% perfectly, because you wouldn't have it in your room if you didn't think it was perfect when you acquired it. But none of those things are alive, okay? And that's the logos, okay? And so, in the beginning was the word. Well, okay. In the beginning was the word, in the sense that in the beginning of civilization, we started to create things by putting words together, one after another. And that allowed us to structure society. But that's as far as our Christianity has gotten us. And unfortunately, the theologians who tell you that the word is perfect and it's only the word haven't bothered to read down to verses 4 and 5 of the same chapter. Okay, so chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of John in the New Testament is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, yeah, it was God. Okay, but then at verse 4, okay, so I'm talking about less than 100 words later, it says, to him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so the point is that Christ was not a word. God is not a word. Civilization is built by words. The Bible is a whole slew of words strung together, and they make us think in a certain way. But they're making us think in a way that early Iron Age men thought. Dr. Jung's point is we have to live our lives, not the lives of these guys that lived 2,000 years ago. And these people who want you, and so the point is that also with artificial intelligence and things like that, that's still articulating a structure that is not alive. It allows us to build up higher and higher, but ultimately it's the Tower of Babel. You can't get to heaven by building an articulated structure. And so the point that I'm trying to make with respect to your comment is that we live our lives in the eros, okay? Yes, there is chaos in the eros, okay? If you look at the universe, obviously there's a lot of chaos out there. And we live within this 20-mile or so high bubble of oxygen that makes us possible. But that's that's one of the things chaos does. One of the things chaos does after 13.7 billion years of development is create a small planet in the vastness of space that has 20 miles of oxygen around it. But that's all on the eros side. It wasn't articulated up by anything. And so Jung often said, life will find a way. And the point is that you can put any obstacle in front of a human being, and our lives will find a way to get around that obstacle. That's what we do. That's what human beings do. And so you can create artificial intelligence that will do a lot of whiz-bang things. But, frankly, I'm not impressed, because I've been around since the beginning of voice recognition. And it's actually atrocious. I mean, when I think of Alexa or Siri, hey Siri, turn on the lights, that's a pretty fundamental command.
Jack ran through the forest. It wasn't
right.
even Jack ran through the green forest. It's just Jack ran through the forest, or Jack ran. I mean, it's kindergarten. It's actually preschool.
Right. And so, I don't deny that we can articulate out our artificial intelligence to operate in such a way that it will mimic human beings. But if that starts to happen in a negative way, I think that life, and this is Dr. Jung's point, life will find a way to turn it off or to off it.
And also it makes less of us, because the old quote of art drives culture, technology simply supports it. It's a tool, like a toothpick after a dinner or a hammer. And it's the kind of thing where if you try to substitute or supplant the body by replacing parts of it with something else, you have less of you to work with. And though you can use them for enhancements to enhance what you have to work with, actually replacement diminishes the totality of you.
Yeah, and I can,
to put it lightly,
I can vouch for that, given that I have an artificial ankle and an artificial knee. You know, they do allow me to get my consciousness around the place, but they are definitely not as useful as my originals were.
Well, and interesting, a surgical counterpoint to that, I had my ACL replaced, but they didn't use artificial pieces. It was this different surgery where they harvested the middle third of my patella tendon, which does regenerate, and they turned it around and titanium pen screwed it into the bones. So it took a couple of months to get my leg to try to not go the wrong way, because I had to train it. Mm-hmm. But it basically replaced a piece of me with a piece of me that then regrew on the other piece. And then my knee's like bionic, but it's all my stuff.
Right. Okay. So reading on here, sometimes something's going to happen on the 21st. Okay.
Yeah, Jupiter and Saturn are conjunct on the 21st.
Yeah, I suppose that this is a comment about Trump, and I don't deny that Trump will do something. He certainly will, and he's going to find out how that works, how really well that works, in the same way that it hasn't worked. I mean, we had all these guys with tiki torches from Home Depot down in Charlottesville back in 2017, and people thought that all these white supremacist groups were going to rise up, as they had done during the 30s and late 20s and 30s, and they were going to have a big rally in Boston a week or two later, and they simply evaporated. Okay, and the same thing with this Kenosha, Wisconsin thing, where the young kid killed a couple of people. You can convince a stupid kid who doesn't know any better to go out and shoot somebody, and just basically he destroyed his life. But it isn't like the world of white supremacy came up to his aid and started a civil war about it. What they did was evaporate, and the reason is because the immature people that lead those groups aren't going to give up their SUVs and their big screen TVs to go out and fight for Donald Trump. That's just not happening.
And also, to use Jung words, he's going to have a freedom proportionate to his scope, but that there are going to be other people who have degrees of creative freedom proportionate to theirs that are going to basically see the egg as yellow inside. And they will not be going for the surface defense. It's a little more in total.
Yeah. So Daniel says, no worries, just throwing ideas out there for the other chatters. I'm just thinking about that humans are biological machines, and if consciousness can live in that, I don't see a reason why it can't live in another machine. Well, actually, life is life, and so far as I know, the scientists haven't figured life out yet.
And actually, that was Turing's chief dilemma of the mathematical machine model, with Turing's work in AI, artificial intelligence, and machine models, and it's a recurrent theme through modern literature as well. And then that's the thing, is how to posit the life force. Even no matter how fluid it is, it's still mechanical, and you need that dynamism.
Right. So there's no reason to be angry or to desire to be in control without fear. They're both reactions to fear, I guess. So the egg analogy is pretty good. I like that. Okay, I'm not sure what that relates to. I can't.
I think to speak to the fear, though, I think we should do a service to split fear up, because I think a lot of people use and misuse fear. Fear is, to me, one of the most important tools we have. It basically generates awareness. It's an awareness of our environment. It's when anxiety hijacks fear and makes it into being afraid. That's the problem. So I think fear is a necessary piece, because it's just another factor of awareness.
Yeah, and Daniel makes a good point here. He says he can't really force anything. It doesn't really matter if you're the leader of the world or whatever. People can still just refuse to listen. There might be consequences, but they can refuse. And that's what we're talking about with the American Revolution, which is, the British Crown was taxing the American colonists, and the American colonists said, why are we doing this? Why are we paying these taxes?
Well, and even the joke within that, too, is that the founding fathers would not allow Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, because they knew he would stick a joke in somewhere, and that would undermine their whole power, potentially.
Okay, I'm sorry about the conflated history. I'm not sure.
I've read stories where they would not allow him to have sole authorship because his language skills were such and his humor was such that he would, from some language perspective, stick a joke somewhere in that was inside joke to him, and someone would get it, but too far later where it would make a problem.
Right. Okay. Well, that may be, but anyway,
I'm not sure.
He was definitely a wordsmith.
Yeah, it's not research; it's anecdotal. So,
and he's got the marble temple in Washington.
Right.
Franklin was a great man, but he doesn't have a marble temple in Washington, and neither one of them care at this point.
Right.
And okay, so Deborah says, Jung makes such a point of how primitive mind has evolved and changed. Okay, so, the point is, yes, I do agree that we are primitive, and that there's a lot of primitivity in the human species. Dr. Jung made the comment that when you're walking out on the street, there are people that are 10,000 years behind us in terms of their psychological development. And you just don't know who you're dealing with. And, one of the pieces of advice I have for my grandchildren, and so I'll give it now, is that you have to make mistakes. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. Make them as fast as you can, because that's how you learn and how you get stronger. And the problem is, with our current president, he didn't get called on his mistakes enough. In other words, people just let him run and just put him off in a hermetically sealed envelope, and he just got to do what he wanted to do all the time, and he could bully his way through. But
and those mistakes are opportunities for learning.
Right. That's how you learn. And so, the problem is that we want people who've made a lot of mistakes and therefore learned from them. And, my favorite question in a job interview, so if you're ever interviewed for a job by me, you should expect me to ask you, what's the biggest mistake you ever made? And the reason I ask that is everybody's made mistakes. And if you tell me a little mistake, then I know you're a liar. And so the bigger mistake, the better. because I know you've learned something from a big mistake. And so, the problem with our president is that he didn't get called on his mistakes. He's being called on them now, okay, and he's only started to feel karma come around toward him, but he lost in the Supreme Court 9-0, including by 3 of his own appointees. And so,
and I don't know if he knows he can't fire Supreme Court justices that he's appointed.
Right.
Skip, as a sidebar, that's an excellent question. That what's the biggest mistake you've ever made? One of Churchill's questions of same along that line is, tell me about your vices. And one gentleman at one point said, well, Mr. Churchill, I don't have vices. And he said, well, sir, either you're that boring or you're a liar, and I can't have either of those in my cabinet. So,
so Daniel goes on and he says, if cells can merge together to become us, then we can merge together to become something else. I don't see what difference it makes if we use technology or biology to do it. And
that's a good question. I would make the point, though, that is not an interdependent example, because the technological merge aspect is not contributing an impetus of life force. It's simply providing logos,
right.
an element. Whereas it's codependent, and we're doing all the work and assimilating that rather than coming to something else.
Well, I have the answer for you too, Daniel. Just a moment. I have it on my desktop, so I'm going to bring it up for you. And let's see. Okay, this should do it. I have to just get into my okay. This is my answer for this, which is that it's like yin and yang. You have biology and you have technology, and never the twain shall meet. And so as one gets dominance, the other squeezes out into something else. And so that's the distinction between logos and eros. Yes, you can, my body is a perfect example of that. I can have metal in my body that serves my body, but it's not part of my consciousness. And so, if anything, my body is limited by having those things in there. And the point is that biology provides a dynamism that technology does not. And people can argue this point until they're blue in the face, and that's fine. And it's a sterile argument. And
well, we went through a whole graduate philosophy class on the image and reality of man and the machine in modern literature, and the sole concentration primarily was Turing's machine model and artificial intelligence. And if you change the program, yes, you change the output, but the metal or the technology that you're adding to a body is not really changing the program. It's additive rather than adding something that is actually innate. So you have to, I think, to answer that question in the affirmative and get past the sterility, you'd have to add something that had its own inner essence. And technology does not yet have that.
Right. Okay. So we've now done a 1-hour preliminary on what it is I wanted to talk about tonight.
That's about appropriate.
This morning.
Got to set the stage.
Right.
It takes a while to build a building. Got to get the foundation out first.
Right. Okay. So the point is, we're thinking about how to think about religion and spirituality, and what Dr. Ferrer is talking about here is the relationship between the experiential and the participatory vision. And you'll remember, if you've been around a while, my experience in the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy. I'll just remind you of that. It was a religious experience. Now, that religious experience was, light from the sun coming into the chapel and lighting only me up. And from my point of view, God, I mean, that was a real religious experience, undeniable. I'm sitting there in this dark chapel, and here I'm being lit up by a very bright sun. And these are stained glass windows, so you can see how dark it was actually outside that day. And yet the sunlight was only on me. And so that's an experience. Okay, that would be an experience, perhaps something like one of the ancients might have had. And it certainly spoke to me at the time, but it spoke to me personally. And it didn't cause me, it caused me to change my attitude about what was happening in my life at that point. But it did not cause me to think that suddenly God had come down and chosen me as the one and only savior of this or that. Certainly,
yeah, you didn't change your name to Joan d'Arc, so
right, and and so so the point is that's experiential, and of course, people have been having those kind of synchronicities since forever, and about 3,000 years ago or 3,500 years ago, they started to write them down. Okay, great. But Moses was into the participatory idea, which was, I don't deny that he had a divine revelation on Mount Sinai. Certainly he did. And he recognized, and this was the Jewish turn in Western thought, he recognized that laws were needed and words were needed in order to guide men. And so what did he do? He chipped out the word of God on a stone and then came down, and that was convincing to his followers. And so, we don't need to, we can argue, but we don't need to argue about the importance of that, because it convinced early Iron Age men to follow these basic principles in order to build civilization. That's what articulation of the word does. And so was that miraculous? Yes, certainly it was. And we don't have examples of similar things happening in that part of the world, at least, at that time. Now, if I go over to India, yes, there were. There was the Bhagavad Gita tells us that there was a vision that a warrior named Arjuna had before a huge battle between the Pahlavis and the I forget the opposing army, but those were really
escaping me too. So,
pardon?
It's escaping me as well. I know the picture and the painting.
Right. And so, he had a vision too, and that was written down, and that has been passed down to us in the form of the Bhagavad Gita. But now we have to think about what it is that those were about, and were 3,000 years, and in the case of the Bhagavad Gita, maybe 5,000 years down the chute from those human beings. and we can think about them in a different way, in a better way, perhaps. But we are the ones that are living, and so that is what Dr. Ferreira is talking about here. That we are now participating in this activity, and as Dr. Jung pointed out in his letter to the Reverend Kelsey, the spirit is taking us somewhere, and this is what Dr. Jung is talking about in terms of individuation. If we think about that, in other words, every living thing becomes that particular living thing and no other. And so it can seem like another, like every human being can be recognized as a human being, but we're all different. And the same is true of an oak tree. An oak tree starts as an acorn. It contains all the programming in it. And that programming is in the form of DNA, as ours is also. And so it knows from the time of the acorn how to become an oak tree. But then its experience in the world, in life, will guide how it becomes that specific oak tree. So every oak tree can be recognized as an oak tree, but every oak tree is different, and the same is true of human beings as well. And so individuation is about developing through that process and communicating with it. Okay, so some aspects of our growth and development will be handled by the DNA, by the programming, but it's really the experiences that we have that determine who or what that human being ultimately is, and what its contribution to the species is over time.
You know, what just came to me with your PT 109 example in Moses is the connection, the idea of proportionate to scope. And Moses goes up Mount Sinai, and he carves, or has carved, or they are carved, the rules, the commandments. And then he comes down with this device of sorts. But then you get PT 109, and this same kind of thing is enacted on a coconut shell. And this message to relinquish to people and make the savior aspect of the situation, both being completely different scales, but the same idea is in place in that impelling enactment of the tablets or that coconut shell and that message.
Right. And human beings have been bumping up against each other for a very long time. And what happens is that things like rules written in stone, they can be convincing.
Right. They can also be cracked.
Yeah, they can be convincing. And so, why weren't there 1,000 stories like that over the next 1,500 years? Moses lived about 1,200 years BC, I think. And so in the years...
You bring up a good point, because Nietzsche spoke to that with, it is not truth, this is about power, because the truth is the truth, but then the way something comes out and is put in place is more of a position of power in the situation of what's put in place. Like you say, why aren't there 1,000 of these instead of just 10 of them? So only the 10 made it.
Well,
so
I mean, there's only one 10 commandments, though. That's my point. One experience that was convincing to that group. And it was a very small group, mind you. Okay?
Right.
The Israelites were a small group. And so there were lots of other human beings on the planet at that time. I think, I looked it up once, but at the time of Job, okay, the book of Job, 500 years BC, there were already 100 million human beings. Okay, and so why is it that Job's story got written up and passed along,
Right.
and no one else's did? Well, it was convincing, and so others fell away. But
And it came out of the culture of those who were in power. It did
well,
not
they
come out of
weren't in power. No, they
no,
weren't
but
in
they were
power.
within the context of those in power, so it could be heard. But maybe something outside of that context was discovered or disappeared or
Well,
deteriorated.
there were lots of other powers in the world at that time. Okay, the Chinese had a university 5,000 years BC,
And
and
that's
so,
fair. Yeah,
pardon,
that's
and,
fair. Yeah,
and
because it was the primary only at that point of that type of.
In that one place. Okay, but there were plenty of other people running around the desert herding sheep and that sort of thing, and they still do it. And so the conveyance of through the word, the articulation of the structure upon which we built our civilization certainly was there, but it was, why didn't the others come through too? Because there had to be 1,000 kingdoms. How many kingdoms were there in Africa at that point in time? I wouldn't have any clue, but there were obviously other creatures, human beings living, and they also had hierarchies and alpha males and the whole bit. So somehow this one came through, but then what happened was that the Israelites participated. They said, okay, I agree, and we're going to do it this way. But they participated, they accepted it, and they then executed it over thousands of years, and now going on 3,500 years since then. And so that's the point, that we all participate. And this is the point that Dr. Ferreira is making, that we have to think of ourselves as participating. In other words, who is it that's going to live your life if not you? Are you going to live by somebody else's rules or by your own? Well, we see how that works out, because sometimes you do have to live by other people's rules, and at least until you learn them well enough so that you don't have to. And so what we've had is the last 4 years is a demonstration that some people think they don't have to live by the rules of the rest of us, and they're in the process of getting a a participatory experience, and why that doesn't work out too well. And so things that are not true fall away. They fall away. And so, for example, the young man in Kenosha thought that he was part of a revolution that was going to go on in Wisconsin by the Lost Boys, but that was only because he wasn't mature enough to distinguish between big talk and the importance of SUVs and big screen TVs to the people he was listening to the adults he was listening to. And so the result was that he went out and destroyed his life, but those other guys, they weren't going to give up their SUVs and their big screen TVs to get into a war that they couldn't win.
Well, in your participatory experience, that quote unquote doesn't go so well, is consequences, and he experienced those in full force.
Right. And so one of the reasons that you and I, Jordan, talk about the Tarot is because it hasn't changed in 600 years. Why hasn't it changed in 600 years? And we're not talking about divination here for those who don't know. We're talking about the Tarot as a roadmap for life. And it's because the Tarot represent the archetypes. And once those were defined by a bunch of crazy French nobles and Italian nobles some 600 years ago, once they were defined, they haven't changed. And, if they weren't true, they would have changed. Okay, things that aren't true do change and they fall away. And some are bigger, some are smaller.
And I think to clarify that, tarot, not as divination, but more of the path, the roadmap to life of self, where these are tools, cardboard oracles, if you will, that go to enact physical representations to metabolize the archetypes.
Yeah. So there's an interesting comment here. Pim says, others rules, yes, others values, no. Well, I mean, even that isn't actually true, because we have, you can live by other people's rules as long as those rules are true for you. But once they're not, then you pretty much can't, and you have to learn how to, sometimes you have to bend rules in order to live. And but that goes back to my dictum about making mistakes. In other words, you can make a mistake that you think you should do this or that, or that you can violate a rule. You can make a mistake that thinking that you can violate a rule, which is what the young man in Kenosha did. He thought he could kill people and others would come to his defense and there would be this hunky-dory civil war. Well, no, that isn't the way it works. And so he's going to spend much of the rest of his life in prison. And so you have to know what rules you can violate and when. And society has built up. We do have a structure for our civilization, and that calls for us not killing one another. And, I have my gun-toting friends often say, oh, well, I have to defend myself against my government. Yeah, maybe, but, I have a friend that has 50 weapons, and you can only use one at a time, and your government has tanks and F-18s. If you have, it doesn't matter how fast your automatic weapon fires, you're gonna lose on that one. And so, the very idea.
Well, and that's kind of a misnomer too of Mark Twain's. I'm behind my country 100% all the time. I'm behind my government only when it deserves it. But the reality is, it's kind of a double-edged sword there. And Americans aren't French. I mean, you made the great example. They may have started out on Wednesday or Thursday with, hey, we're going to do this. But by Sunday, we'll have to go back to my office and I have to go fill up the SUV. The tank's low. And all of a sudden, this resurgence of this huge enactment goes away because, well, I have to go cook dinner. The kids need to, go to the store. These mundane things kill those movements and show that they're superficially kind of sanctimonious, actually.
Right, and it goes right back to my earlier comment that, the first three of the first four presidents of the United States were involved in refueling because,
right.
A bunch of farm kids in America with single shot muskets can have this idea that they can be free of the British crown and they can foment a revolution. But what finally won the Revolutionary War was not courage of farm kids with single shot muskets. It was alliances and money. it was money that the second, third, and fourth presidents got, and it was the alliance with the French that made the United States win the Revolutionary War.
Right.
And, you know, strictly speaking, we might have ended up being dominated by the French, but it didn't happen that way, fortunately. And the French were happy to sell off the Louisiana Purchase shortly after that. So,
right.
Because they knew it would be too difficult to try to govern people at that time from that distance. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the Ferreira now. And so we're in a portion of the book, and I'm reading from page 186 of this book, which is called Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, the Participatory Vision in Human Spirituality. And I hope I've given enough of a preface for that. So Pimp Jerk says, we're born into a system of rules, but our values are our own. When they become in conflict, we are forced to break the rules to grow and realize our true potential. Well, we have to learn our values too. You know, we're born into a system of values too. And so, you know, you have to develop your values, but you have to do that through experience. And that's why I say, you know, the most important advice I can give young people is go out and make mistakes, make as many as you can, as fast as you can, because that's how you're going to develop your values and understand what's what and what you can change and what you can't change. And
then that feeds in not only what is valuable, but also you get a strategy sense of what's acceptable risk.
Yeah. So Deborah says, Jung believed we were born with an ego, a huge step beyond Freud, who believed the ego, the id, did not start until birth. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to swing at that pitch. But thank you, Deborah. That's probably true, I would say. Anyway, okay, so here in this portion of the book, Dr. Ferreira's has its subtitle, Relationship Between the Experiential and the Participatory Visions. He says, to avoid any possible misunderstandings of my position, I would like to offer here some concluding remarks on the relationship between the experiential and participatory visions. Although the problems of the experiential vision are legion, the participatory turn does not demand its total abandonment, but rather its limitation to certain dimensions or stages of transpersonal inquiry. Okay, so in other words, I can tell you about my experience in the chapel, which I demonstrated here a little while ago, but you know, that doesn't mean that it applies to everybody. It was an experience that happened to me, and it was meaningful to me. And that's what synchronicity is, and that is why it was important to me. Rather, what is argued here is the need to move beyond a purely individual and intrasubjective experiential account of transpersonal and spiritual phenomena towards an understanding grounded in a participatory knowing and practical wisdom. Let me try to clarify here what I mean exactly by limiting the experiential vision to certain dimensions or stages of transpersonal inquiry. On the one hand, I believe that experiential discourse can be legitimately used to refer to the individual inner dimension of spiritual and transpersonal phenomena, which is what I just did a little while ago. From our previous discussions, it should be obvious that the participatory vision does not deny or eradicate, of course, the inner and individual aspects of spirituality. Rather, the participatory vision simply reconceives this intrasubjective dimension in terms of the participation of an individual consciousness in transpersonal or spiritual events. So that's what I'm doing. I'm transposing that internal experience, which was a synchronistic experience, and participating in the sense that I'm making it transpersonal, because I'm talking to the followers on YouTube and to Jordan about that event. And
in doing so, you also speak to that statement earlier. I can't remember the name of the commenter, of that. Then we become our better self. We expand and we grow. And by you going through this to not only elucidate it and then share it, you're giving more fuel for everyone, me, you out there, to then fill up those tanks more full at larger and larger scales, and also go further and further within to do the same.
Right. And, these synchronistic events simply occur to me all the time. For example, this week I read about an article about synchronicity that was written by a German psychologist. I don't have his name right at the tip of my tongue right now, but I was very interested in this article that was published in Psychology Today, I think. And so I was planning to write to him. And the very next morning, before I wrote to him, he friended me on Facebook. Now, what are the chances of that? I mean, just out of the clear blue sky, here's a psychologist, a professional psychologist in Germany, who I have nothing, I couldn't tell him anything about psychology, probably, that he doesn't already know by his training. And yet he friended me just out of the clear blue sky on Facebook. And so there he is. And it happened within 24 hours of me reading and first hearing of his name at all. And then thinking about the fact that I wanted to write him and get him to speak in the wisdom path.
And there's the connection right there. That it came out energetically within you. It connected, and it was a message of sorts.
Sure.
That then he was probably in a similar place. You guys were converging to a confluence. And when you thought it, he was probably thinking about something similar, notwithstanding anything about you. But then when you thought it and then he thought it, you both came together. Because then there was the turn, he may have Googled, well, who's working on this? And then the C.G. Jung Deaf Psychology Reading Group comes on, and he's like, oh, I wonder if he's on Facebook. Click, 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 and there you are.
Yeah, there I am. And there I'm thinking about him.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So the important point to realize then is that the experiential, although important, is only an aspect of spiritual events. And this recognition prevents the pitfall I have called experiential reductionism. Okay. So it also avoids experiential inflation. Okay. Because I can run around town saying, oh, wow, God is speaking to me and only me, which God was speaking to me and only me, and it has nothing to do with any of you, is the point.
And the whole experiential reductionism piece is, anything reductionism is then making everything about that thing, literally reducing everything to it's only that. And like when you say it's only a component.
It's also taking away the significance of it, because I can take away the significance of it. I can say, well, gee, the sun goes across that part of the sky every morning, and it lights up that particular pew every morning, and you just happen to be sitting there that particular day, and that was all coincidence, and it doesn't have anything to do with God saying anything about anything. And
that's a good point, because most reductionism is innately anti-contextual. You're taking things out of context, which then removes them from it basically disconnects things, and they die. I mean, it's
right, and so they can die if I think of it in that way, or somebody poo-poos it in that way, then it can die. But the point is that I'm not going to let it die because it was so meaningful to me. There was something there in that moment that was unique to me, and I can't change that, and it's very powerful. And so, notwithstanding all the reductionism that you can do, you still can't take the experience away from me. But that doesn't mean that I think that I'm now the second coming, not at all. So, as most traditions tell us, spiritual events cannot be reduced to human experiences because they flow from dimensions of existence in which human beings can participate, but that transcend the merely human. Okay, so that certainly transcended the merely human. I couldn't have planned that in any way, shape, or form. Could I have done, geez, if I studied the movement of the sun carefully, and the angles that it would come through the windows, and that particular window at that particular time,
and which trees had been limbed outside and which hadn't, and
right, all that stuff. Yeah, maybe I could have planned it, but the other one, and I urge you to watch my video called Finding the Living God, in which I included this video. But the other one was a video in which I had a religious experience on video, and there is no way under any stretch of the imagination that I could have planned that event, and nonetheless it was extremely powerful to me. So anyway, but you'll have to go watch Finding the Living God to see what I'm talking about. All right. So with this in mind, it is safe to use, I believe, experiential talk to refer to the individual inner dimensions of transpersonal and spiritual phenomena. Thank you, Dr. Ferrer, you're confirming me. So I can refer to those. On the other hand, it may be possible to regard the relationship between the experiential and the participatory vision in a sequential manner. And he gives some citations, and then he says, from this viewpoint, the descriptive value of the experiential vision geared to a Cartesian model of cognition may be limited to the first stages of the spiritual path, in which the spiritual seeker undergoes temporary openings, which are typically interpreted in Cartesian terms as transient experiences, being more prone to fall into spiritual narcissism and integrative arrestment. And so, we've been talking about this right along, which is, it neither stopped my integration of the possibility of spiritual benefit from it. But it also didn't make me narcissistic about it, other than to say, wow, here's something I can show others to talk about it. Because if I don't have these pictures of it, if I don't have a photograph of it, if I don't have a video of it, you're never going to know what I mean, or you won't believe me. And so, the first thing that came into my mind when this light came on me in the chapel, and it was all these rays of light, like the biblical light, I said, wow, nobody's going to believe me unless I take a picture of this. So in that instant, it changed my attitude, which was the important thing for me. But then I said, nobody will believe this unless I take a picture. So in that 5-second period, I picked up my phone, took the picture, and then turned the phone back on me and took a picture of me, so that you could see that this was, a really powerful experience. But I'm not saying that that's anything special.
And I would say also, too, you are included in that nobody, because 6 weeks later, 6 years later, you might start to erode the memory and go, well, maybe it wasn't so spiritual. Maybe I was just fooling myself. But now that you have the pictures, it brings you back to that moment. And the trauma, the positive version of trauma is influence. Mm-hmm. And it brings you to that influence of that moment, which is then always fresh when you remember it, and it maintains and substantiates the power of it and keeps it around living.
Right. So Pimp says, in Plato's cave, the slave that became untied knew to depart the cave of ignorance. In the light of the sun, beyond the rules of the cave, he acquired his values. Okay, fair enough. That's not the point we're talking about here, though. Going on with Dr. Ferrer. As the spiritual seeker deepens his or her understanding of these insights, as well as begins to embody and live them in the world, the limits of this experiential account become gradually evident, and the participatory vision may start looking like a more adequate framework to understand transpersonal and spiritual phenomenon. Okay, so that is what happened with me, okay, which is that the adequate framework for it is that I can show you this experience, and thereby help you too to understand what's going on here. And it is participatory in the sense that I am participating, I am enacting what I think should be enacted out of that experience and other experiences that I have had. In fact, this entire YouTube channel, which now has over 1,100 videos, is entirely about my enactment of what I think these things mean. And some people think that it's useful to them, and I'm glad of it. And that was,
I'd like to speak to Pimp's Plato's cave example, because I get that, okay, it's not what we're talking about here, but I think it's on the other end of the spectrum, because I'm steeped in that story. And Plato's cave is a great example for him to bring up as a point of origin, because that's the point of releasing the shackles. But here, and coming out into the light, here we're now talking about picking up tools of our experience in our lives to then go forward and go within, but not to go into a prison of the cave. It's to a whole revisioned, so to speak, cave of just the interior, which is not a cave at all. So I think it comes out of that, and that would be way back on the spectrum. But so I don't think it's so inapplicable. I think, though, that this place here in this topic is then about the enactment is not leaving the cave for the first time. That's kind of adolescence in a way, and rite of passage of coming into the child, becoming the parent of the adult. This then is now what the middle-aged or older adult does to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
So I think it's valid, but it's on a different part of the spectrum.
Okay. So at this juncture, for example, individuals may tend to feel that spirituality is not so much about having special private experiences, but about cultivating emancipatory understandings that transform not only their inner being, but also their relationships and the world. And so, yeah, I mean, it has transformed my relationships and the world. Just ask my wife, who has to suffer through the alarm going off every Sunday morning so I can have these conversations.
Well, and actually that whole emancipatory understandings, that's a reference to the metaphor of Plato's cave that then occurs throughout the process.
Okay. What I am suggesting here then is that the adequacy and validity of the experiential and participatory visions may be relative to different, though not necessarily mandatory, stages of spiritual development, which is what I'm saying, that I'm trying to point out that these stages of spiritual development do exist, and that you can expedite them a little bit by knowledge. And so that's why this teaching is here. In any case, seen as valid to refer to certain dimensions or stages of transpersonal inquiry, the experiential vision is not abandoned, but simply qualified and situated by what I believe is a more fruitful understanding of human spirituality. Okay, and I concur, obviously, or I wouldn't be reading this passage of his book. But I do believe that the participatory vision is not only a more fruitful, but do I believe that the participatory vision is not only a more fruitful, but a final understanding of transpersonal and spiritual phenomena? I can only answer this question with a firm no. As I mentioned earlier, by no means do I claim that the participatory vision discloses the final truth about the nature of the spirit. And so, as I read at the beginning, the quote from Dr. Jung, Dr. Jung did not claim that he knew where the spirit was taking us or is taking us. What he observed is that the spirit is taking us. We don't know where it's taking us. Right. And so this is the same thing basically that Dr. Ferreira is saying here, that he doesn't believe it discloses a final truth. And I don't believe that either, but I do believe, because I feel the spirit moving me and causing me to develop a sore throat every Sunday morning, that I think it's worth doing. I don't know why I'm doing it per se, but I am doing it, and that we all know. So.
Well, Jung's response to the question, do you believe in God? And he says, I don't have to believe, I know, comes, that makes the direct impetus to do your own red book. Get off your couch. Don't smoke opium. It's not going to just come to you. You need to do the work, and learning and then enacting through your life becomes part of your experiential red book. Maybe not a doodle, but it's the kind of thing where you are actually experiencing to bring more within yourself. And then in that red book, it's not about where you're going or us finding the same thing. It's that you go to find is the more important piece of the red book. And when he says, I don't need to believe, I know. Well, he knows because of the red book, and he went through these places.
Right. And that's the significance of the doodle that we were talking about yesterday, which is what Colleen had pointed out to us, is that if we do that doodle, it will start to develop and it will start to tell us things. And that's exactly the experience that I had. I don't know if I can find mine. right now.
Yeah, and yours was poignant too, because those what initially are this verticality, this columnar slivers of landscape, and then you realize no, they're all the same. They're all interrelated and moving around. And
right. So I'm going to show mine only because
it's a good one to show. It's a good example.
Right. It's exactly what we're talking about here. So,
and the good thing about your example is it's not warring. It's inclusive of the honesty of don't lie about yourself, where that's the whole, you basically in your painting, your doodle, you express the whole environment, pain and all.
Okay, so here I'm expressing 2020 is what this is, and the way Colleen Kibert explains it is, and first I had done this as just 2 lines. So Colleen says, draw a straight line, and then draw a line that doesn't like straight lines. So whether you believe it or not, this image is 2 lines. And the straight line is right down the center, and then the line that doesn't believe in straight or doesn't like straight lines is the rest of it. And so initially what I had on the paper was just a bunch of looks like scribbles on the paper. And so then I just waited for my psyche to tell me, okay, what am I going to do about this? And I had these colored pens. And so it said, well, start adding color. And what happened was that my psyche gradually told me what colors to use and where to use it. And so ultimately this does express 2020 from my perspective, because it told me to use orange to represent the President of the United States, to use red to represent the GOP, and blue to represent the Democrats. And then I started to go through the years. So you read this top to bottom, left to right. And so in the upper left, you have the beginning of the year, January, which was taken up by the impeachment process. And you have all the confusion there, and the president being supported by the GOP with the 2 columns of red there. But obviously, I wasn't thinking of any of that back when I was drawing the line that doesn't like straight lines. I drew that, and it looked like a bunch of scribble on the page. And then my psyche was the one that told me where to fill in the colors. And so the magenta and the dark purple represents Americans who do not wish to be polarized by politics. And so from that, halfway through, from that basis of the American people, which doesn't want to be polarized, what was forced out was this blue, the Democratic candidate that got squoze out of the tube so that it would stand up against the onslaught of the president's campaign for the year. And the green represents young people, and you see how much the young people have been forced out of the system in the second half of the year. But the purple and the magenta are still predominant in the second half of the year, once they knew they had to come. And so that's understanding the spiritual process of coming from within, and that's what that image represents. And it was entirely about my psyche telling me how to move my pen and then what colors to use as I go forward.
And I think it's important to note that you included the whole scene. It wasn't about excluding what you didn't want, like what hurt, what was painful. You included it so you get an honest, truth and an air of truthfulness view to then have as a frame of reference, so you're not deluding yourself. You see and you know what's in the environment. It's like a giant radar for your psyche.
Right. Okay. And so what happens when you do that? And I'd go back to the 10 years from 1995 to 2005. And during that time, I did a lot of painting. I did portrait painting. I did a lot of different kinds of painting. And, you know, I was, okay, in 1995, how old was I? I was 49 years old. I had never really thought about painting in my life. Only once before I had made a little stab at it for a couple of weeks. But then in 95, I just felt this tremendous urge to paint something, and I didn't know what. And I started to paint a water scene every day. I had 2 collies at the time, and I would walk out to this overlook that overlooks the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, right at sunrise typically, and I painted that scene, I don't know, between 300 and 500 times over a 5-year period. And I did it all in 15 minutes. I took a very small set of watercolors with me, and I painted that scene over and over and over again. But what happens when you do that, it's like Bob Newhart and the infinite number of monkeys. Eventually you might get something good. And so in that case, you know, I
turn over enough rocks, and
I did enough paintings so that some of them came out good. But what I found, and this is the important point, is that when I was doing painting, my life worked better. Okay, and I can't point to anything specific.
No, that's good.
But the point is that I found when I was communicating with my unconscious in that way, my life was working better. And so now, when I've now come back to this doodling with Colleen, I can feel that same sense rolling through me every day.
And I second that. And even from the same onset of years, 93 to 95 and 92, and then 99 and 2000, it kind of stopped. I was too busy in architecture, and things started going to hell. And they were financially fine, but I started to feel something's not right. And then coming around 2002, 3, and I start my tarot deck in 2000. I start going, okay, I'm going to do this, but I need 3 years of none of that. But the discipline of not doing it became a painting in a sense, and it changed everything.
Okay, now I have to wrap this up because I have another session. 10. I have another session this afternoon, but I have half a paragraph to go, but I don't want to stop in the middle of a paragraph. So, all right, so let me continue on with this paragraph anyway. Neither the indeterminate nature of spirit nor the dynamic quality of spiritual unfolding can be fully captured by any conceptual framework. Okay, fair enough. In other words, we can't define it, and we never will. And the idea is to learn to go with the flow. As the history of ideas shows, claims of ultimacy have been invariably proven both to be naive and deceptive. And so anybody that tells you that they have the truth you can be sure that they don't.
Well, and also too, the indeterminate, where these doodles and poetry, metaphor, symbols, glyphs are about the closest thing we have to approaching it, where the visual language, the metaphorical language, is the mother tongue of the archetype, not English or some other textual language.
And the major arcana of the Tarot proves the same thing, which is that there is no ultimate answer, but what we know is that for those 22 cards at least, regardless of what Tarot deck you pick up, they're all pointing back at the same things, and they describe those same things differently by image or by discussion, but nonetheless they're the same archetypes, and they have always been with the human species since the beginning, and always will be, everywhere and always, and in every clime and place. And so now we know that, we can see that these are unchanging, and when people try to introduce new ideas into the Tarot, they just kind of bounce off in one way or another.
Well, and Bill Moyers, when he asked Joseph Campbell in the Power of Myth series, Joseph, what do you think, Joe, what do you think the meaning of life is? And he said, well, I don't think people are searching for the meaning of life. He said, I think they're searching for the experience of life as the meaning in the living of it. There's a life-affirming spirituality that is the experience of it, and that is the meaning, rather than coming to a meaning and then going forward like a product. So he flipped it in a way where it was this process, these doodles, this enactment, rather than having an algebraic, X plus Y equals Z. It wasn't that simple. It was more experiential and participatory.
And that's where I got off the Joseph Campbell bus, actually, because Joseph Campbell was my guru for about a decade in the 1990s. And I read all of Joseph Campbell. And the day I got off, I remember it very clearly. I was sitting in the parking lot of Onslow Memorial Hospital in Jacksonville, North Carolina, listening to this audio tape of Joseph Campbell. And there was a Q&A there in which a young girl got up and said, what is the meaning of life? And Campbell said, oh, there's no meaning of life. There's only an experience of life. And I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to say that. Okay, because
and that's where I got off too. Because when he turned it around the second time in the Moyer special, he added a little there, but you could just see he had a bad taste in his mouth from that experience. And but I was off on the bus, and I'll go back to Jung and Nietzsche, etc. Because at that point there was that to me was a silo, ivory tower, academic response that was actually not in keeping with all of his other responses, but that was kind of that piece that was out of place that he was stuck on.
Yeah, maybe. Because the point is the point that Jung made in the quote that I read, which is, we don't know where the spirit is taking us, but it is taking us somewhere.
Right.
And so to say that everything was one and done back when the Bible was written or when Jesus lived, that's not the case. And
when Campbell does this, he goes, the experience, and he drops it down. Jung says it's moving forward. It's taking us. So when Campbell makes that statement, he literally sits down and goes, oh, it's just about experience, which is then vague. Whereas Jung says, keep on going.
Right. Okay. So Ferrer says, what is more, claims about final truths are hostile to the nature of being and knowing espoused by the participatory vision. Okay, so when Jung was asked, do you believe in God? And he says, I have no need to believe, I know. I can't give you that experience. You have to have it yourself. And
Right.
I didn't know what I knew when I heard that the first time was, I too know. But then I had to spend 10 years figuring out what the heck I knew. I mean, the truth of it came through to me, but I'm saying, okay, what do I know? And so I had to spend a decade trying to figure that out. So this is what he's referring to here. So if rather than pre-given or objective being and knowing are enacted, dynamic and participatory, then it should be obvious that the claims about final, immutable, or universal truths are both misleading and distorting. Okay, so I'm going to stop at that point. But the point is, anybody that has the final truth is either deluding themselves or they're trying to delude you, because we don't.
Yeah, hold your wallet.
Yeah, that's right. Hold your wallet. Very well put.
And that's to me, that's the fifth clair. There's clairaudient, clairsentient, there's actually five. We go through, and the clairgustance, which is taste, but the other one is clairfraudulent. So,
Yeah. So, well, and so then that goes back to why is it that the Vatican is such a beautiful structure? Okay, because it was shaking down very poor people over thousands of years, and so they could afford to have the very best, and they did.
right.
Thank you, Deborah. Deborah Bowman Stevens says, excellent session. Okay, I don't know what we've said, but I hope we.
Thank you, Deborah. Thanks for coming.
We can know everything in the cosmos, but nothing outside of it. Yeah, I think that's right. So anyway, okay. I think my voice has run out for the day, and we've managed to get through 2 hours of discussion here. This afternoon, I do believe it is at 2 p.m., but I'm going to double check.
Eastern, 2 p.m. Eastern, I think is that.
Yeah. Okay, where is it? Okay, there it is. All right. So today at 2 p.m. Eastern time, I will be hosting Melissa Townsend, who is going to talk with us about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And the thing, she's talked to us once before, but now she's created a flashcard set, which she's going to introduce to us today. And the reason that I think this is valuable is that in keeping with the issue of art, Melissa has done two things. Number one, she has done her own translation from the Sanskrit of the Patanjali, which is 195 verses. So she's first translated it into words in English, but then she has done a separate painting about each verse. And the significance of that to me, I've been familiar with her work for half a year now, is that it showed me how to think about the Yoga Sutras and how to think about all of these topics that we've been discussing since the beginning. And so just to give you an example, the first verse is about chaos. And so Melissa represented that by showing a painting of a glass of milk spilled on a table. And of course, we all have that chaos in our lives, certainly if we have children, but something chaotic happens to me every day, and probably 5 things. And so one thing that we need to know, and the reason to understand spirituality at all, is so that we don't get overwhelmed by the chaos, because the world is chaotic. And usually I have my little red squeeze ball here, but it seems to be buried in books at the moment.
That's the chaos of today. The red ball's gone.
Right. The red ball of the chaos is gone. But,
chaos itself.
But anyway, the point is that the reason to have any spiritual practice, and even a spiritual practice which involves reading Dr. Jung's work, is about taking yourself out of the chaos, okay? Because life is chaotic. There's no doubt about it. And this is the point that Melissa makes right at the very beginning of her teaching by showing us this image of a glass of spilled milk. And then it explains what to do about that, okay? And so the Indians have been thinking about spirituality for a lot longer than Westerners have. And so the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are a good way to pull out of it. It doesn't mean that they represent an ultimate truth. They don't, but they represent a practice by which you can pull yourself out of the chaos. I suppose you can do the same thing by watching one of our videos here, but
any discipline of the ritual that is persistently enacted,
right,
breeds mastery, and mastery then just leads to further discovery,
right,
or inflation. I mean, you can go either way, but typically it leads to further discovery.
Yeah, and just for an example, mantras are intended to protect the mind, and that's what they do. And so for a long while, because my wife is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, she and I studied Tibetan Buddhism, and I learned a few mantras in that practice. And one of them is a healing mantra, and I don't understand the mantra at all. We memorize it in Tibetan, and it's in the Tibetan version of Sanskrit, right? But in terms of protecting the mind, it's extremely useful. So, for example, on Friday, I had to have an MRI. And if you've ever had an experience of an MRI, I've had a few of them over the years, but an MRI is an extremely noisy thing. It's noisy, and you're in the equivalent of a coffin, and you have to lie there and do nothing for 30 minutes. And it's like it's like having a battle go on around you. And you.
I asked them, will you push the button to get the kids to stop clanging the pots?
Yeah. So you have this battle going around you, which is like chaos. And I've learned long ago that I can pull up one of these mantras, which I don't understand a word of it, not at all. But I've nonetheless memorized it in Tibetan Sanskrit. And so if I say this mantra, which is called the 100-syllable mantra, it allows me to protect my mind, and the time passes very quickly. And so if you're in a chaotic situation like that, you can learn to do something like that, some sort of spiritual practice that can protect you from whatever might be happening around you. And so, I found on Friday, as I have done many times before, because I also use the same mantra when I'm getting a crown put in a tooth or something like that. Somebody's drilling on your tooth. And, if you use that mantra or a mantra, you can hold yourself together. And so it's important to understand how to use spirituality and how to use spiritual techniques to get you through life. I don't mean to make any suggestion that there's anything woo-woo about it, or that there's any greater power around it, other than the fact that it's intended, and this is what the Tibetan Buddhists say, it's intended to protect your mind, and that's exactly what it does. And so
I find harmonics. It regulates me to balance. I either go within or I'm surfing on the chaos. It so regulates. So I couldn't
well, and
agree
it's probably
more.
why everybody's so enthralled with music. Everybody's running around with things in their ears, listening to music, because it basically takes you out of the chaos of what's going on around you. And it's
and it gets you moving resonantly with your resonance, because if you like it, it's not interfering with you, it's actually enhancing you.
Right. And so you'll know you've gotten to some level of maturity when you can turn the radio off,
right,
and actually listen to yourself. If you can actually pay attention to your own self, then you've reached a level of maturity, and then you can make decisions for yourself. And I remember getting to a time when I was about 40 when I just couldn't listen to music anymore, because myself was trying to communicate with me, and listening to the music just got so irritating that I couldn't do it anymore. And so since I was 40, and so now we're talking about half of my life, I've turned the radio off. My wife and I do not listen to music. If we're on a long trip in the car, we might listen to an Audible book or something like that, but we don't allow outside noise to interfere with our communication with ourselves. And
I have a mundane ritual, but before I turn the car off, I turn off the radio, CD, whether it's NPR, news, music, radio. I turn it off, because I want the choice to not have, when I turn the car on, it's just there. Because then I'll assume and I'll listen, and I don't like that song, and I'll start changing the station, or I turn on the news or something, or put on a CD. I want the choice to, if I don't even think about it and I go to the grocery store and I come back, I didn't even think about touching that button.
Yeah.
And it's important, I think, to choose where I don't want media right now. And you want the silence, and you can take the silence.
Right. So it's all well and good to go around listening to your iPhone all day, every day. And learn a lot from that, and you're better listening to audible.com if you're doing that. And it's sometimes fine to play music as a mind protector from the chaos, but you have to learn how to regulate that, it seems to me.
I find that music's a mantra in a way. When you're not doing a mantra, the
works
music
the
becomes, it works the same way. And then times you don't want them any mantra except silence.
Right. Okay. So I have to excuse myself and make this an end for today, but we'll continue this discussion next week. And next week. And by the way, Dr. Ferrer has agreed to do an in-person featured session with us on the 7th of February at 1 p.m. And so I hope all of you will put that into your calendar. Dr. Jorge Ferrer will speak to us from Ibiza, Spain. and not only about this book, but also about his later book. This book is actually about 20 years old, and he says he has evolved his thinking since then, and he has pointed out to me a newer book that he published in 2017, which I've ordered, and I intend to read by the end of January. But for now, I'm going to continue talking about this book, and then the culmination of that. I'll probably finish long before February, but in any case, February 7th, Dr. Ferreira is going to talk to us in person about his perspectives. And I hope all of you who listen to this video will come and join us. And
excellent.
Let me put, for those of you who are on YouTube, here is how you get onto our, that is the link at the bottom of the YouTube chat is the link to our MailChimp registration. And if you register there, you can express what you're interested in, and you will receive my notices that say this is happening at this time. And so I urge you to join us. And oh wow, Miles is here. Miles, you have to get a life, man.
Well, Miles just hopped on, so we got to change the guard. Miles, you got to take it from here.
Yeah, and Miles says it's been suggested I do qigong, like prayer 5 times a day. It would be good to do. I have no doubt, Miles, and some of the things that I've observed, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Muslim world, and especially in Saudi Arabia, where it's very rigidly practiced. And I've seen my colleagues praying 5 times a day, and I say to myself, what could possibly be wrong with that? That we can learn from others. And, the Muslims know something about their spiritual practice, because they do pray 5 times a day, and they do have rituals that they follow. And I found them to be salutary. And so if Qigong does the same thing, that's great. So peace.